Good vibrations.
Welcome to episode 113, and we got another three-way, three-time zone conversation today with a couple of very interesting guests. First off, I've got a researcher whose name kind of sounds like a hip-hop pseudonym. You might think he's a rapper or something. He's built up quite a following on the net with his YouTube channel and his blog, looking into a wide variety of subjects. We're talking Crrow777. Crrow, welcome, man.
Hey, man, thanks for having me, Mark. Good to be here.
And alongside him is a guy who's been cranking out quite a bit of collaborative work in recent months with Crrow on their podcast together. And he also puts out his own podcast. I guested on his show last year, Secrets of Saturn. We got Jason Lindgren in the house. Jason, welcome.
Thank you, sir. Nice to be here.
First off, let me just ask Crrow, that's an interesting name you've got there. I'm sure you've told this story a million times, but just for the benefit of my listeners, do you want to recap on how you came by that moniker?
It's just a play. It actually came about when email first started because people would type Crrow, send me an email, but it's basically a play on my corporate birth name, which I no longer use. Each of the names of my corporate birth name not only had 7 letters, they summed to 7, so that's how that started.
All right, so that's the origin of the 777.
Yeah, it's basically just a poke in the eye to the corporate name.
All right. And Jason, your show, Secrets of Saturn, that's quite an intriguing name for your podcast. How did you settle on that one?
Well, a lot of the elite symbolism that all of us researchers analyze seems to have a lot to do with the planet Saturn, for better or for worse. A lot of Saturn and Sun symbolism is very interchangeable, and we see it used in a lot of media and all that sort of thing. So I thought I would try and uncover the secrets of Saturn.
All right. That's quite an undertaking. And how did the two of you find each other and come to link up with the work you're doing together now?
I think Jason, you might have to correct me here, Jason, if I don't remember this correctly, but I think Jason contacted me to come on Secrets of Saturn, and I recognized him as a good speaker and a person who seemed to be headed in the right direction. And as we got to know each other, we realized that we worked and spoke very well together, and he's a good balance to my kind of more brash delivery of the content that I give to folks. So is that, do I remember that correctly, Jason?
Yeah, I actually reached out to James Alfred from Sage Sigma and you at the same time. Jay answered me first, and you two were already friends, and then he spoke on my behalf, and you came on, and then the rest is exactly as you said it.
So what inspired me to get in touch with the two of you was hearing the collaborative shows you've done looking into music and mind control. The one in particular was the one you called Music Declared War on America and Won. I think that was episode 62. I thought you had a very good grasp on how social engineering through popular culture gets done, and you obviously put in some quite exhaustive research on that. So I figured we could talk about certain aspects of that today. But I have done a lot of shows recently re-examining the counterculture and, you know, how that played out in terms of the music and how it changed society and stuff. So I thought it would also be good if we allow the conversation to veer off in some other directions too, because there's no shortage of things to discuss. So by all means, let's keep it free range and let's just go wherever the conversation takes us. But I thought to start off, maybe we should just consider some of the key ways in which popular culture has been used to sow certain belief systems and ideas and values and morals into the mindset of the general public. I think most people you mention that to would still deny that it could ever take place, but I think the research the three of us have done have shown that it very much takes place. So maybe we should just consider some of the key ways in which, you know, people's mindsets get affected by popular culture. Who would like to start on that?
Well, I can jump in there, Mark. It's pretty clear on the tail of, I don't even know how much exhaustive research we've done for the Crrow 777 radio program, that all modern media that goes out and reaches millions of minds, and that encompasses everything from news to television to music, just the whole thing, lock, stock, and barrel. It's all designed to socially program. For people who pay attention, they will notice that things that appear in music are then again re-echoed on their favorite television show or in their favorite movie, as an example. I have posited the idea that basically the totality of Western culture, as we see it today, was built on the back of full spectrum programming through media of one sort or another.
I would second that absolutely. The social engineering level is just insane. They're hitting us everywhere with everything. And it's not even just Western culture anymore. Now even all of that has been filtering out to nearly every nation on Earth, I would say.
What really brings it home is when you look at things like the J-pop market coming out of Japan and K-pop coming out of Korea, and even pop music coming out of the Balkan nations of Europe and places like that, and you see exactly the same symbolism and exactly the same kind of imagery and agendas being trotted out from these different industries in different parts of the world. And it becomes clear that it's not some haphazard random thing. And it's not artists just trying to be cool and mimicking each other and all of that. It's a coordinated agenda that is going on in all countries around the world.
Well, when Jason and I did our Tavistock Institute, we pretty much demonstrated that there are people from the Tavistock Institute in Hollywood that get their little nonsensical programming memes into all the content right before it goes to camera. And I think that we can easily draw the line into music from almost any country now. And I would point out, when I was young in the late 60s, early 70s, we had things still called singer-songwriters, where it was supposed that the people playing the music had actually written the music. We've come a long way from there. As a matter of fact, I've forgotten their names, but there's a couple guys that come up in a lot of the a lot of the comment sections that are apparently responsible for writing a whole heck of a lot of Western music. I would suggest that a lot of the pop music that we see these days, these folks really don't have a lot to do with putting together the content they're performing, and that really opens the door for social programming to be inserted into nearly everything.
Right.
Well said.
And I've put forward the view before that the very creation of the corporate music industry in the US and in the UK particularly was specifically to roll out these agendas and to have a mind-controlling effect on large numbers of people. And certain people have said to me, no, you're taking it too far. You can't say the very industry was created for those purposes. But from what I've seen, that would appear to be the primary reason for creating these institutions in the first place.
Well, I would beg to differ with the people that are calling you out on that. I think you're absolutely spot on. We can demonstrate that the entirety of the hippie movement was orchestrated, from the drugs they used to the clothes they wear to the idea of communes and community. Everything that was hippie was created by places like the Tavistock Institute. And it goes without saying that all the music that came on the tail of that was, just embedded with social programming. And that sets aside the clear view that we can get of places like bands like the Grateful Dead now, which were shown to be on the payroll of the FBI. People like Janis Joplin. And, I guess I'll set aside the idea of the 27 Club now. But again, that's another tell into the programming aspects of what we see. Basically, in my view, what it comes down to is it appears that as we approached World War II, most of the media in the West was weaponized for military usage, and that was never undone. That's my view, and I've got good research to back it, but I don't think you're off the mark at all making statements that the reason media like this exists, that reaches millions and millions of people, is to do one thing, and that one thing is social programming.
Yeah, right. There's absolutely no doubt of that. No matter however it started way back when, as soon as it became commercialized and money became involved, it was taken over. There's just no doubt about that. When you look at the media companies, what we call the big six now, everything out there that's mainstream media is under one of these six umbrellas, and that's it. So there's the control right there. That can be proven on paper just with mainstream information.
Right, and that's not arguable point either, Jason. That's a good point. But I would also bring up, there was a time when everyone kind of marked the corporatization of music around the time the live album from Peter Frampton called Frampton Comes Alive came out. The joke was always made in the United States that people didn't even really buy that album. They just went out to their mailbox one day and there it was. That was the joke. But I would submit that the corporatization became visible at that point. The control, the processes, the programming, the very reason for popular music's existence, to the earliest inklings of the rock and roll movement, it was put in place for a reason, and it was controlled by people who knew how to get their message out and how to shape culture in the West.
What about how far back we can take this whole thing? Because I think of the corporate music industry as we know it now as dating back to kind of the mid-1950s, sort of Bill Haley and the Comets' Rock Around the Clock onwards, and the emergence of Elvis Presley. But, you know, how much further back do you think we can take social control through music? Because presumably, if the Beatles and the Rolling Stones were the two biggest groups of the 1960s, and they were the assets, the chosen ones of those that control these things, if you go back to the days of the classical music greats like Beethoven and Mozart and guys like that, presumably they would have been put up there in those prominent positions in exactly the same way. They wouldn't have been allowed to just get there under their own steam and by random chance. So, you know, can we say that that whole scene was most probably controlled in the same way?
Well, we can draw the line absolutely with someone like Paganini. Paganini is quite a ways back, and there are documented accounts of people having hysterical moments in his audience. There are well-covered accounts of him being one of the first people to play what's called the Devil's Interval in his musical scales. So that pulls it all the way back to Paganini. But if we want to come a little closer to the modern era where it's a bit easier to get accounts we might trust a bit more, I would point out that the weaponization, the actual weaponization of the way we play music in the West was affected beginning, I think, in the 30s. And that was attributed to people like Rothschilds and other people who wanted to take the orchestral A tuning from what was called a Verdi tuning, and there were a number of tunings. I know people like to argue this, but I'll use this for the example. The Verdi tuning was changed to 440. You know, Jason and I have covered quite a bit about numerology and how 44 is often symbolizing death or death's doors. Well, the entirety of orchestral tuning of all music in the West was pushed to the 440 frequency as early as the 30s. They made a few runs at it, and I would have to review that to know the exact date. But it's even attributed that Nazis, if they existed in the way we think they do, people like Goebbels may have been involved in that. I don't know if Goebbels is the right Nazi, but I'm pulling from memory here.
I've heard it was Goebbels, yeah. Any thoughts on that, Jason?
Well, first of all, I can hear the difference between 440 and 432. I recorded 432. I've tested myself in blind tests, and there is something to that. A lot of people poo-poo it, but I'm telling you that there's a sensation difference in my mind when I hear 440 versus 432. So if there's anything to the whole sacred geometry thing and the way these numbers break down and the way the frequencies resonate, I would say that 440 feels a little more forced and has more of an aggressive stance to it. And I'm pretty sure there's science to back that up too.
There's actually a lot of science to back that up. There's a lot of people who tried to push against the idea of the weaponization of music, claiming it was simply 8 cycles a second. What's the big deal? But it can pretty much be demonstrated that when it was moved to 440 hertz, it ups the excitement in the human body. And then there are people who came along that said 432, the old Verdi or green tuning, was in step with things like the Fibonacci sequence or how a leaf grows or how a body grows, these types of ideas. But at the very base of it, if there is anything to the symbolism, the numerology, the encoding of so many things we point out in this world, there's no getting away from the idea that they moved it from 432 to 44. 440 encodes 44, and you know, time and time again, we've shown the powers that be in this world encoding the idea of death or the idea of death's doors into the number 44. So there's quite a bit to look at there, but I don't really think there's any denying that there was a concerted effort by people who could be classified as banksters or Nazis or others to actually move the tuning of all orchestral A instruments. And when you think about what that means, consider this. Consider a band goes in somewhere where there's a piano that they want to record, but they want to record in 432. Well, guess what? That piano sitting in that room is tuned to 440. So you can kind of see how it was pushed in and then kind of standardized and made. It's a bit of a hassle for a band now that wants to do it. And actually, that's not 100% true because we're digital now, so it's easier to tune instruments away. But I think you understand the point I'm trying to make.
Of all the questions I get asked when I do a public talk on the music industry, the one about 432 versus 440 hertz always comes up. You know, whenever there's a Q&A section, it's guaranteed somebody is going to ask that question and say, "What, you know, is there any truth to this thing about 432 being the harmonic frequency?" So it's an idea that really does seem to resonate with people. And when they start looking into conspiracy-related matters in the music industry, 432 versus 440 is one that's right out there.
Well, if you really want to find out, listen to AC/DC at 440 and then listen to it at 432, and I assure you, you will hear and feel a difference.
That is so funny, Jason, because I was about to say the exact same thing. If you get some of these hard-edged rock bands and you tune them to 432, you will not get the same punch. The truth of the matter is that 440 raises an excitement level of some sort, and 432 is much more soothing. There's no getting away from it, and people can argue that all day, but you know, I've witnessed it for myself. Jason's a heck of a musician, and he's done the same. So the proof is in the pudding, folks. Yep.
People can argue it all day, and they do. And what you mentioned there about Paganini and the Devil's Interval, I did an interview with Dr. Hans Utter a while back, who's a musicologist, and he was saying that the Devil's Interval, so-called, crops up in the intro to Jimi Hendrix' Purple Haze with that very distinctive guitar riff you get at the start, which I thought was quite interesting.
Yeah, you know, if we look at people like Hendrix, and I know a lot of people will have trouble with this, you're looking at a scripted personage. You're looking at a person who was a member of the 27 Club, which automatically identifies him for who he is. Anyone that is in the 27 Club is in the little band of miscreants we're talking about here. But, you know, I have done breakdowns to try to show people that Woodstock did not go down in the way that it was portrayed to you. And as an example, you know, Jimi Hendrix was supposedly the biggest act in the world. And in his contract for Woodstock, we are told he was going to be the headlining band, last guy on stage, you know, paid the most, these kinds of things. If you go back and look at the Woodstock footage, you're told there were, well, depending on the accounts, you can hear anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million people there, depending on where you look it up. When you look at the audience when Hendrix actually takes the stage, first of all, a lot of it's just him jamming. He's not really playing songs per se. There are a couple places where he actually acts like he's playing to people, but when you look out at the audience, there's hardly anyone there, and we're talking about the biggest act in the world. And this sets aside things like Woodstock being moved 3 times and never getting a new name, but anyone can go look up a Woodstock ticket, the initial tickets that were sold before the event was ever placed, that says, "We're going to be filming you and we can use your image." These whole things were constructed, and Hendrix is just in the middle of that big construct, in my view.
Right. The Woodstock concert took place in a town called Bethel. It wasn't even in Woodstock itself, and I gather it's quite a distance geographically from Woodstock, and as you mentioned, they kept the original name for some reason.
Well, it's a weird thing, you know. You just brought up the word Bethel. Anyone who wants to track, it was moved apparently twice in common history. White Lake and then Wallkill, I think, are the names, if I remember them correctly. But think about what we're talking about here. Initially, there were going to be a few thousand kids. It was going to be at Woodstock. Then we're told they moved it to either White Lake or Wallkill or wherever the heck the claim is. They kept moving it, but these tickets had already been issued, like thousands of tickets had already been issued before supposedly the Woodstock location was canceled. So anyone getting one of those tickets wouldn't have even known where to go in the first place. But anyone who wants to scrutinize the event of Woodstock will find out that it's just not covered. It did not go down in the way that history wants you to accept that it did. And what got me going on this is I had remembered that the spell for Woodstock was cast under a new moon. In other words, no moon at all. And when I looked at the documentary not too long ago, year or two ago, maybe a year ago, I noticed they were showing shots of a half-lit moon, and this was a claimed documentary. So that was proof positive that they were passing off footage from a different event into the supposed Woodstock documentary.
And there's something to be said for the moon symbolism in the first place. But let's not forget, Woodstock was not the first of these big events. Monterey Pop Festival is very well known that they were doing tests on people, not just with the bands, but with the audience, with all the acid and everything. So these are big old experiments they were doing on people for social engineering purposes.
I would take that a step further, and I would point out that any single act that was involved in the Monterey Pop Festival is an agent of the system, was a player, was there to do what they were there to do. That guy Phillips from the Mamas and the Papas, who was apparently either a press agent or something like that for the Beatles, was a prime mover and shaker and all that. And if you follow his history through the timeline, I mean, he smells like rotten fish by the time you get to the story, you know, in America, where he's having incest with his daughter, who was a Hollywood star. The whole thing was a construct, and you know, people don't want to remember that portion of the hippie movement in the way we're pointing out. But you've got to call a spade here. The Monterey Pop Festival was the kickoff for the social programming and the drugging out of a generation that the hippie movement became.
And just as a matter of interest, I've got the original Woodstock, the English Woodstock, about 10 miles up the road from where I am. And that's the site of Blenheim Palace, which is Winston Churchill's ancestral home. So there's lots of connections there to, you know, the British establishment. And then we have Woodstock over in the States, which is all about social engineering and stuff. So, interesting connections there. Crrow, you mentioned the 27 Club and all these celebrity deaths, Hendrix, Morrison, Joplin, etc. There's all kinds of theories out there about whether these celebrity deaths are genuine takeouts of these artists, possibly done in a sort of ritualistic fashion, or whether they're hoaxes. And these people just go off to live out their remaining years outside of the public spotlight somewhere, or whether it's a combination of the two. Have you got any thoughts on whether there's a hard and fast rule to that?
Well, in terms of putting out a hard and fast rule, I would have to focus on it for some time and see if I could locate the tells. In my view, these are hoaxes. These are just more encoding. So much of the false news is encoded to a calendar, and the calendar that we use is completely jacked up at this point. But the point I would make here, these artists are not stupid people. Many of these artists belong to bloodlines. Who in their right mind would volunteer to be the lead singer for the Doors, knowing that all these other people are going to die when they're 27? They're going to be dragged into some black mask room and sacrificed. No one would do it. It's ludicrous to consider, and that even sets aside the ideas that every single one of these people has family. Even if you didn't want to accept that there's a bloodline thing going through much of the music royalty, and they're called royalty for a reason, I would estimate. My point here is, when you look at the dates of the deaths, when you look at the idea of the 27 Club, when you look at all these things, it's all clearly timed. It's all clearly part of the overall media agenda, and it's designed to do many things. You know, first of all, people get invested in their idols. So when one of them dies, that spreads misery and sadness, and that's a manipulation. It's no different than going in, you know, I remember watching some coverage not too long ago of supposedly how Snow White was made by Walt Disney. He'd apparently, we are told, hawked himself into debt, millions of dollars, and Snow White was going to be one of the most expensive feature films made to date, and all this other nonsense we're told. The point here is the apparent measure of success we are told Disney was looking for was whether or not he could make drawings, cartoons, make a human being cry. As it happens, we are told that the audience cried when Snow White ate the poison apple. And he had said, lo and behold, look, glory be, there's a new day here. I can draw pictures, make a cartoon, and manipulate human beings into crying. So when we understand what I have just said, that there was a time before when a cartoon was viewed as just a cartoon, a kid's thing, and all of a sudden Snow White comes along, and there's these drawings being done that can now manipulate a human being into investing emotion into a made-up, drawing. We start to understand a little bit more about what we're talking about in the music industry. But to pull it all back around and to cut to the chase, in my view, almost any major music star that you see, like Kurt Cobain, blow their head off, or any of these other ones, it's just staged nonsense.
We've got the Chris Cornell and Chester Bennington thing this year as well, which researchers are trying to wrap their heads around. I guess it's just more of the same.
And in my view, there's no doubt. And I don't even spend time to break these things apart anymore. I had people come comment on Crrow777radio.com in one of the recent episodes where they were starting to try to draw the lines to the song Black Hole Sun to the recent eclipse, and on top of it they started to show much of the encoding that occurred around his death, even pre-echoing apparently in some of the song lyrics, which we see so often.
Right. I've got a chapter going in my upcoming book, which I've titled Same Shit, Different Decade. And I'm just talking about some of the symbolism that's in 1980s pop videos, which we see in contemporary pop puppet videos from the likes of Lady Gaga or Katy Perry or whoever. I'm just making the point that the same symbolism is right there in 1980s pop videos from Britain, as we currently see in output from the US. And you could even apply some of these same symbols to stuff that was coming out in the 1960s. So it seems that they roll out the same kind of agendas, but they just put a different twist on it and tweak it slightly for a new generation. But they're operating to tried and tested templates all the time. Is that something you'd go along with?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, I'd take it a step further. It appears to me that the American industry of music has always been overlorded by Britain. There's the idea of the first British invasion, which everyone's aware of. We're told the Beatles came to town, and they did, in fact, change the world. But there's a second British invasion, in my view, that not many people recognize, and that was the launch of MTV in the United States in the early 80s. What most people don't realize is nearly all the videos on early MTV were British videos. And if you want to take that forward a little bit, we can take bands like Supertramp. If you take apart Supertramp's iconic album, Breakfast in America, you will understand that it's pre-echoing the events that are going to take place on 9/11 all those decades later. There's just no getting away from these things once you clear your mind and you begin to take an adult, measured view of what's visible.
I would also suggest that there's a pretty hard line between the 1970s and the 1980s, and I'm pretty sure I brought this up in a recent episode with Crrow, that the 70s was seeing the death of Americana, and by the 1980s, that is the old America is dead and gone. Everything is commercialized, over corporatized, and everyone is just obsessed with materialism, and it's very evident in the stark differences between the music of the 70s and the 80s.
Well, I think that's a good point, Jason. I came of age in the 80s, and what we see in the 80s was a party. When the 80s came to town, it was like feel good, do whatever you want. People had money, and that, in fact, is a big dividing line in my mind where what used to be America was changing, but so few of us could see it at the time because the 80s was a full swing party.
It's certainly an intriguing thought that British military intelligence, MI6, in bed with the Tavistock Institute, may have been calling the shots all along when it comes to popular culture. A lot of it is attributed to the CIA when you get into the counterculture scene in the 60s and the LSD all coming out of the CIA. But there's a lot of evidence to show that there were very strong links between the CIA and British intelligence. And in the very formation of the Office of Strategic Services, which became the CIA, there were key players there that came out of British intelligence. So it may well be that the Brits have been, running the show all along and just taking the Americans under their wing.
I would go so far as to state that the American music and much of the media industry has a mommy and daddy, and that mommy and daddy is the British, whether you want to call it the royal family, the powers that be in Britain. And that does go further in other directions, but there's no getting away from it. If we take things like the death of Prince, the death of Prince was clearly an homage to the birthday of the Queen of England. Right. And that, the first time we ever heard the words Purple Rain was all the way back in an America song, some 40 some odd years earlier, where in Ventura Highway, America drops the line Purple Rain. And when you look at the verse that was lifted from, he's talking about a guy named Joe, which was one of Prince's alias, coming on a falling star, all these things that reference the 40 some odd year later death of Prince. And when he was asked, why did you put this in your music all those years ago? His response was, it beats me. These things are not hidden from us anymore in the digital age. We can review, we can research, we can look at things endlessly now. This was not the case when the Apollo moonshot went off in the 60s. People were a slave to their television. If they wanted to show us 4 minutes of the Apollo stuff. That's what we got to see, and no one really had the ability to record. Well, we've come a long way since then. We can review things endlessly now. So to put a fine point on it, I would submit to you that the entire existence of Prince was basically for the Queen of England.
Well, there was a brand of beer that came out through Green King, which is the largest brewery in the UK, and it was called Purple Rain, as in Reign. And they stated that they'd put it out in homage to the Queen, her 90th birthday, but it coincided with the news of the death of Prince. So what a coincidence, huh?
There are no coincidences in this world, and it didn't just coincide. It coincided to the day. And that's not even the half of it. You know, we have a place here in the States called Niagara Falls, which is a big popular waterfall. They lit that place up purple. If you want to fast forward through time, you can see things like David Gilmour of Pink Floyd fame out on his own touring. I think it's after the death of Rick Wright, rather recently. And in the middle of David Gilmour's set, he says, we're going to do an homage to Prince here, and he busts into Purple Rain. You can see the echoing of it over and over and over. And if you can pull your mind out of being entertained and examine what's going on, it's a very telling thing indeed.
So bearing in mind this concept of same shit, different decade, what are some of the ways in which culture creation and social engineering is manifesting itself currently, would you say, in contemporary times? What are the main agendas that we're seeing now? Jason, maybe you want to give some thoughts on that.
Well, let's talk about your favorite subject in music, and that's hip-hop. It's obvious that was completely co-opted. And while it may have started on the streets in the late 80s, early 90s, the industry got a hold of that and then completely perverted it into this horrible materialism and degradation of women, and it's all about self. It's actually akin to the Satanic Church, where it's all about promotion of yourself and everyone else be damned. I don't know how you feel about that, but that's kind of how I see it, because anything mainstream rap these days is just, it's just evil, really.
Yeah. I don't even like to refer to myself as a hip-hop DJ anymore, because you mention that and people's minds just go to the likes of Lil Wayne and Drake and Nicki Minaj and all these jokers and clowns, and I've got no interest in being associated with that anymore. So whereas I used to identify myself as a hip-hop DJ, I no longer do, because, that's not hip-hop, but it's what most people think of as hip-hop, and it's just degraded satanic garbage, and it's been made to be so. It's so obvious.
Well, early hip-hop is very, very different. Like, I actually like it. They took a lot of the beats from the 70s R&B records and used very creatively the limited digital tools that existed at the time to make very cool beats. And a lot of it doesn't even have any voice over it. It's just really good beats taken from very good music. And then very quickly, once you start getting these rap superstars, you see the same things happening just like happened in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, to go with your concept of same shit, different decade. They swooped in, took it over, and then turned it into what they wanted to do. And what have they done? Absolutely decimated black culture to the point that there's people walking the streets with their pants hanging around their ankles and their underwear hanging out.
Right.
It's not just black culture that's been decimated, though, and I would point this out. In the same way that the early hippie movement, from the folk movement into early rock and roll, was used to literally change the fiber of culture, drugs were introduced. The idea of free love, of course, the birth control pill, and Tavistock had to do with that as well, and the CIA getting the birth control pill into the scene at the same time free love happened. They really began to change the culture of America that was the 50s. Well, what hip-hop and rap have done is taken the exact same thing that rock was doing. They injected it with the gnarliest steroids you've ever seen, and it is doing damage openly now in ways that people never would have detected in the early inklings of folk music and rock music. And to put a fine point on it, I even see shows now where their whole reason for existence is to try to get people to buy into that in the 80s, the importance of rap was much more than it is. They're rewriting history to try to solidify how important rap is in the music industry. But what we have now is, if you watched any of the 2017 MTV Music Awards, it is predominantly that genre of music. And what you see is lack of musicianship, almost no musicians. Probably none of those people wrote the music they're performing. But what's worse is it's been simplified down to very tribal beats and programming and rhyming. And I would point out to everyone, in the idea of casting spells, rhyme is a critical thing. And this is not lost in the world of hip-hop, the people who produce it.
I would agree. There's this whole genre now which is referred to as mumble rap, because you just can't make out what they're goddamn saying, and it's probably not worth listening to anyway. But yeah, mumble rap is the new thing.
To me, that sounds like an excuse for the ones who can't actually make up lyrics. At least they can do this too, because all you need is one piece of software to make your beats for you, and then babbling over it, and now anyone can be a rap artist, right?
Jeez.
Well, consider this. Consider the early days of sampling when it was starting to be an issue. Oh, should these people be allowed to take music from other people to make their music? And it was a big thing. That's no longer a thing anymore, by the way. You know, that people do whatever they want, basically. But sampling, the very idea of sampling is this. There used to be a time when certain people dedicated a portion of their life to become adept at a musical instrument. By the time we got up to recording and sampling and started to move towards the digital age, what they had done is removed the requirement for any musicianship of any sort to be involved in the making of what they would call music, which in my view is not music. Music implies that there are harmonies. Music implies a lot of things that are absent in a lot of the modern music that we see. But the main point here is these people are not talented. They may be good performers. They may be good speakers, they may be good rhymers, but they are not musically talented. And they are being credited with all this musical talent because they sat behind a mixing board, sampling and creating electronica. It's not the same thing. Sit down at a piano with a real musician and you can see the difference. And while I am disparaging the genre because I know what it's for social programming. It's for reducing the mindset of large groups of people into an infantile mindset. My point here is this. It's not really music if you break it apart. If you look what music traditionally was and what it has become now.
Well, it's certainly not now, and it's not been the case for, or that has been the case for a very long time, about the last 20 years, I would say. The original ethos and culture of hip-hop when it first emerged was based on talent, I would say. You know, these original MCs were wordsmiths, they were the poets of their generation, and they did exhibit great skill at putting words together and telling stories. That was the original essence of hip-hop, but it's been corrupted, it's been bastardized over a long period of time, and it's very easy to see how it was done. But certainly it started out as a meaningful art form, I would argue.
Yeah, I would accept that argument, but I would add this caveat. We're talking about poets here, basically. Poets of their time. They've taken the idea of what maybe the folk singers did in cafes back in the day, and they've made it modern to their time, but we're not talking about music here for the most part. We're talking about poetry, aren't we?
Well, again, I would go back to the early days of hip-hop where they were sampling old soul and funk records and breaks and stuff, and I would argue that they were doing it in a very creative and imaginative way, and they were making music by matching the rhythm of the words from the MC with the rhythms coming out of the music. But you've got to go back a long time to find music of that kind of style. What we've got now is everything produced on computers, an overabundance of auto-tune, and just completely untalented puppets and stooges being wheeled out to fulfill agendas, as you've said. I would certainly say that's what's going on now.
Yeah, I would agree. I would agree for the most part with what you've posited here. But just to put a fine point on things, consider maybe in the 50s going to a school and taking a music theory class where you're going to learn the history of music, where you're going to learn about scales like Mixolydian and all these other things most people have never heard of, when you're going to learn what keys have how many sharps, how many flats, when you're going to learn all these things about what used to be a much higher-minded art form. If you look back at the classical era of music and look where we've come. And, you know, I'm not solely disparaging rap because rock and roll did its share of lowering what music had once been. At one point, music was a very high-minded endeavor, in my view. And I think as we got into the folk era and then we got into the rock era, it began to lower. And then I agree wholeheartedly with what you've said. Where we are now, we're below the basement. You know, we've dug a hole in the floor of the basement. That's how low it's gone.
Right. So I want to move on to some other subjects shortly, but just while we put a lid on this whole culture creation thing, we're just considering contemporary ways in which it's all getting done. And I just wanted to pay lip service to this whole transgender agenda thing that we've got going on, which, people get all upset about this and they say, oh, you can't criticize this kind of thing. It's supposed to be all about inclusive societies and that sort of thing. Whenever something becomes a trend and a movement and it affects large numbers of people and there are groups set up to represent it, then it's an aspect of social engineering, and it's made to happen by the agencies that specialize in this sort of stuff. It's not grassroots, it's not organic, it's not natural. We've seen it so many times before and people still fall for the tricks. That's my standpoint on it. So this whole popularization of transgenderism, gender fluidity, gender neutrality, all this stuff is just another aspect of how all this gets done to change culture, to change the mindset of the general public. Have either of you got any views on that? Jason, I know you probably have, with reference to some comments you've made on Doctor Who recently. And you're normally a mild-mannered kind of guy, but I know you got a bit upset about what was going on there, so maybe you want to comment on that.
I did because, the social engineering got really strong in the past couple of years on Doctor Who before they ever got to the recent announcement. The last 2 seasons were horrendous with just how much symbolism. I mean, they were using pyramids and all that sort of thing. Like, they were just lacing that through everything in Doctor Who. Is to anyone like us, you watch those and you're like, wow, they're being really blatant these days. But this whole transgender thing to screw up the youth is so bad right now. And I've had too many arguments and I literally had to pull away from it. Most people don't recognize what's going on with the casting of a female Doctor Who. It's just, they don't understand. They think it's great and wonderful and all that. And I'm like, you don't get it, do you? Like, besides the fact that it's a destruction of a long-standing male figure who isn't a beating over the head. This is the way I win my battles is through strength. It was, a male role model who used his brain. That was the thing I always identified as a child, because I was always a brainy, nerdy kid, and the Doctor used his mind to defeat his enemies, not like a superhero beating them up. You know what I mean? So they've now taken that away. That has been stripped completely out of society. So the kids growing up are no longer going to have, especially in England, because I know how big Doctor Who is there, they're not going to have that male role model figure anymore. All of a sudden, gender fluidity was introduced into the modern incarnation of Doctor Who, which is very different from the original show that ran from 63 to 89. There was never in the original show this concept that Time Lords would switch between genders. Never. I've seen every episode. They slowly but surely started introducing that concept since it was brought back in 2005. And they didn't even talk about gender fluidity until just a few years ago during the Matt Smith era, if I remember correctly. This is when they started with the things that Time Lords could go between males and females, and then all of a sudden we see the character the Master jumping from male to female, and now, of course, we have the main character going from male to female. So if you want to see programming, there's programming, my friends.
I would add something here. What Mark said, I think, is spot on. It's absolutely, this idea of transgenderism being a big deal now is absolutely constructed social programming. The problem with that is it's going to have real world effects on young people coming up now that will begin to question their sexual identity. But we can identify this as a construct simply by going back to a time like the 40s or 50s. A baby's born, someone would come in, look between that baby's legs and say it's a boy or a girl. And guess what? 99.9% of the time, that was going to be a true statement for the entire life of the baby that was just examined. That kind of proves the construct we're in. But here's what I suspect. I suspect the current transgender push as both a reason to divide and a reason to change culture is going to be used in some ways to legitimize what's been going on in entertainment for Lord knows how long. If you look at the history of stage, you will find histories that claim women were not allowed in the door. And in kabuki theater and other places, men played all the roles, even the female roles. This is also true of Western stage in many of the histories you can find. There are people out there now that are claiming many of the very famous actors or actresses, whatever you want to call them, are not the gender you think they are. When I first was hit with this idea. I couldn't see it very clearly, but I decided to challenge it. I have since challenged it, and there is a there. There's something going on. If you go to any modern listing of movies being played on a television, you'll find that 80 to 90% of all the listed actors are male. Of the female actors you will find listed, I would estimate that around 80 or 85% of the female names have a male attribute in their last name. Now, I'm still trying to work out some rules to get around this, but I really do suspect that the transgender thing that you guys are addressing right now is going to be used in the long run to legitimize what's been going on all along in the entertainment industry.
And this is attacking our culture on multiple levels, too. It's not just that they're swapping genders with in Doctor Who. They're attacking the male role model everywhere. I mean, how many strong male figures are on television or in films these days? You know, a lot of the father figures on modern television are ding-dongs. You know, they're dopey and they're dumb, and the woman is dominating them. You see this concept over and over and over again.
Well, I mentioned this in our last show, Jason. Go back and look at a show as mundane as Hawaii Five-0 from the 60s, 70s era. And what you see is the lead actors, the supposed male role actors there, they seem like adults. They seem like grown-ups. When you look at television now, there's no grown-ups to be seen. And I would argue that the last place in the world anyone should look for a role model is from the entertainment industry right now. And you can compare and contrast all day long what was portrayed some decades ago on television of what an adult is to what it is now. And one of the main dividing lines I draw is The Simpsons. In my lifetime, the one place I can kind of remember where being a slob or being stupid or being other than the best you could be started to be cool was when The Simpsons came out. And, you know, it's had a big effect. Almost all of television and movie that you watch now, there's not a role model worth following because the mindset of the idea has been lowered by leaps and bounds.
Well, the concept of the rugged American man, like the guy that every woman wanted in the 1940s, I mean, that's just gone now. The concept of like an early Sean Connery or John Wayne or something like that, man, you don't see that anymore. They're all feminized.
Well, and again, that was an overreach of the time too, right? Because those were strong men treating women like secondhand citizens. I mean, there's never any balance to it. Right now, people would complain that the male role model is going away. Beforehand, when we had the John Waynes and the Sean Connery, people would complain, you know, where do they get off treating women like that? Women make up half our world, and yet they're being made to wash dishes all day and, you know, be subservient to these men. What we see in entertainment is exactly what we see in the breaking down of the word entertainment. The word entertainment breaks down to go in and hold your mind. And there's a reason for that. This is programming, no matter what decade you go back to. But the main issue I see right now is if we go back a few decades and look at the mind, the height of the mind behind what is being created, man, it is plummeted into the modern day. And it's turning us all into a bunch of drooling chimpanzees at this point.
Just a connected thought. The idea of Doctor Who becoming a woman, to me, is akin to the suggestion that we heard recently that there might be a black James Bond. There was talk of Idris Elba being the next actor to portray James Bond. And a lot of people that buy into cultural Marxism and such might say, well, what's wrong with that? You know, why can't we have a black James Bond? Well, the character of James Bond, as created by Ian Fleming, was a kind of upper-class white individual who attended Eton Public School and joined the British military service, military intelligence, and, you know, he was a white character. The same way that Shaft in the blaxploitation movie of the 70s was a black character. You wouldn't expect a white actor to be playing Shaft. So that's why it's an issue to have a black James Bond, in the same way that it's an issue to have a female Doctor Who. Certain characters are meant to be a certain way. You know, how long is it until we get Alistair in Wonderland, you know, a male character in that story or something?
Well, God forbid you did the other way around, though. I mean, heaven forbid you cast a Chinese guy to play the new Shaft.
Exactly. It's not going to happen.
You know, it's like some things need to be sacred, man. If that's the way it was written, that's the way it was written. If you want to make new stories out of these things, you have to respect what the characters were, you know? I mean, What if they cast James T. Kirk as a woman? You think people wouldn't get a little ticked off about that? But all of a sudden it's okay in Doctor Who because they intentionally wrote it into the newer episodes that they could switch bodies, or excuse me, switch genders. So, well, they do switch bodies.
It's just entertainment catnip, guys. It's just divisiveness. I mean, what a beautiful shiny red apple they've got. You know, they could make Bond a black man and get all these people up in arms and divide and conquer and create all these issues, when any kind of grown-up in the room is going to look and say, guess what? James Bond is a made-up character. He came from a fiction novel. He is portrayed in fictional movies. Why in the hell should we care? Why should we care if James Bond is cast as a Saint Bernard, for crying out loud? If you take the adult mindset stance here, what you're looking at is just the simplest step to the left to divide and conquer, just by simply switching gender or the racial portrayal of a character. And it's ridiculousness. It shows the degree that entertainment has taken over our world. These things should not be that important to us, I would submit.
You're totally correct, because since when does an actor's opinions on politics matter? Yet you see these celebrities constantly being asked about these things, and sorry, most of them seem like freaking morons to me.
If you wanted to take entertainment at its face value, regardless of who is cast in what role ever, the main criteria should be, was it good? Every time. Regardless of who the character is or who's playing the character, that should be the measure. But you see, the problem here is that we've all been convinced that entertainment is more important to life in this world than it is. You see, entertainment should be the lowest rung of the ladder of importance in the existence of a human being. But unfortunately, where we've come in the modern age, with the media saturation being what it is, everything from the news to Hollywood to music, we have been so inundated with it every day, all day long, as part of our life, we've all been convinced that it's more important than it is, when truly the real importance of being a human being is to have the gift of life and to have the ability to do the things a human being can do. But, you know, then here comes entertainment. And what is entertainment for? Well, I'll tell you what it's for. It's to waste your time. That is what entertainment is for. Every time you sit down to watch a movie, you are not doing some higher-minded thing. You are not learning how to play piano. You are not reading some famous book of some sort. You are not learning something new in your life. You're not doing any of the things that could make a true difference in your life. You're basically throwing an hour away to watch a movie.
Right. I agree. But can you imagine the cultural impact of somebody like Justin Bieber coming out tomorrow and saying, guess what, the earth is flat? Can you imagine the impact that would have on the public around the world? Somebody of that ilk making that kind of statement.
I wouldn't be surprised if that actually happened, to be honest with you. What entertainment does is it looks for clear water that we can all see through easily, and then it throws mud in that water. That's what entertainment does. That's what the entertainers do. That's what they're hired there to do. Maybe all of them don't even understand that that is what they are there to do, because they're just not bright enough to figure it out. But there are plenty who do understand that's what they're there for. So for someone like Bieber to come out and do that would not surprise me in the least, because it would just sow confusion in the world.
Right, for sure. Okay, so I did want to get into some other subject areas and take the conversation in some different directions. I thought maybe it would be good to spend a little time reflecting on the recent solar eclipse that you guys had in the US, which we in the UK missed out on. But, you know, the conventional narrative when it comes to solar eclipses is that it's the moon passing across the face of the sun and it obscures it, and then it passes over the other side and everything returns to normal. But Crrow, I know a lot of work that you've done has been into the true nature of the moon, what it may be, in contrast to what we're told it is. So with reference to this recent eclipse, I wonder if you've got any reflections or observations that you want to offer to people there.
Sure. This started, I'm currently living on the East Coast of the United States. The last thing I filmed when I was living on the West Coast was a partial solar eclipse. The main reason that I had taken all my tools out, besides the fact that I was recording every eclipse I could, is because it was a solar eclipse and I wanted to see if I could detect the moon coming into the solar eclipse. I had a full spectrum camera. I had an 8-inch telescope, an 11-inch telescope. I had one big honkin' telephoto lens with a doubler on it. I had solar filters. I had all these things at my disposal, and I could not detect the moon coming into the solar eclipse. So fast forward all this time to the solar eclipse that we just had in the United States. Where I am, up in the state of Rhode Island, it was something like 60-some% total. Not total, but 60-some percent. I set out to film it, and immediately we started getting sprayed across the ecliptic by the chem planes, what we call them here, the jets that leave the white trails in the sky, and I didn't think I was going to be able to film. As it turns out, I used a full spectrum camera and a telescope and a solar telescope to film, and I did the same thing again. What I will tell you at this point is it's logically provable that the moon is not causing the eclipses. There are a lot of people out there trying to make the claim that Vedic astrology or astronomy has shown the way with the idea of Rahu and Ketu, or the nodes that are involved in the eclipses. I'm not that knowledgeable on that topic, but I think it's an interesting thing to look at. This is what I can tell you. We're told that the sun is an infinite light source. To put this into perspective, if you have a point light source, like a spotlight as an example, and you point it at an object, the shadow will cast a certain size of that object. If you move the spotlight closer to the object, the shadow will grow larger. This is not true of all light sources. One of the light sources this is not true of is what's called an infinite light source, which is what we are told the sun is. No matter the position from the infinite light source to the object casting the shadow, it will cast a shadow the size of the object that is casting the shadow. That's what we're told from the rules of lighting. With this in mind, I will point out, NASA tells us that the sun is roughly 93 million miles away from us, and that it is an infinite light source. It further tells us that the moon is roughly 250,000 miles away from us. If you understand what I have just told you, then it would be impossible that we could not detect that supposed rock in space called the moon going into an eclipse, and yet we can't do it. And that is a very telling thing indeed, but that really sets aside the other things that we have discovered along the way, like the disk of the moon being transparent at certain times. This was demonstrated during the last eclipse I filmed in the West Coast, where we could see the limb of the sun right through what we were told was the disk of the moon.
Right. So what I've heard about the true cause of the eclipse, is that it's caused by the black sun, so-called, which I think is another rendering of Rahu, isn't it?
Yeah, that's a tricky thing. I've started to pay a bit more attention to the Vedic astrology ideas, or astronomy, however you want to go with that. If you simply just go look up the idea of nodes, if you get Western explanations for what a node is, it will be vastly different from what Eastern people will tell you a node is, and then there's everything in between. It's not the easiest thing to nail down, but it's like everything else. If you work at it, possibly you'll get a better understanding. But I can tell you without reservation, the moon plays no role in solar eclipses. The moon is not a rock in space, and it is not covering the sun during a solar eclipse, and we can demonstrate this now.
I think what it all comes down to, as Crrow and I both always said, we can't exactly nail all this down yet, but there's so many inconsistencies. We know that the mainstream notion that especially an organization like NASA tells us, it's not accurate. We don't know exactly what it is, but we know that there's something wrong, and we need to keep working at this.
And sometimes you just have to be prepared to say you don't have all the answers about something. People expect you to have them, but in reality, who really can answer all these big questions in life? Sometimes you have to say, well, I don't know what it is, but I know what it's not. You can so often express a situation in the apathetic by saying, well, it might be this, but one thing it definitely isn't is this. I think that's a good way of expressing things sometimes. The place where we live is not a spinning ball hurtling through the infinite vacuum of space. That's just my take on it. That's what it's not. I can't really tell you what it is, but so often you can say what something is not.
I think you're spot on. I think you have summed up perfectly where we find ourselves. We understand now that this world has been misdescribed. We understand that space is misdescribed. We understand that it is very likely that nothing is leaving what we call our atmosphere, that there is some kind of a hard, fast boundary between what we call our atmosphere and what we call space or low Earth orbit. We can tell you all day long, and we can demonstrate in some ways that the moon is not a rock in space. We can tell you that solar eclipses are not caused by the moon. But as you so succinctly pointed out, we can't tell you exactly what is going on and what these things are. To understand that you're not on a ball spinning faster than the speed of sound, it's something like 80 times the speed of a rifle bullet in orbit around a sun is one thing, but then to draw an accurate picture, that's another thing entirely, and unfortunately we can't do that yet.
Sure.
And while we can't nail all this down, Crrow and I did, early on in our collaboration together, a 6-part series on space fraud, and we built it up from the beginning of the world space programs all the way up to today. And in every episode, we tore space programs and what we're shown of space apart. There's just inconsistency after inconsistency. So again, while we can't nail down exactly what's going on here, for those of you who are having trouble swallowing that something's wrong, go listen to that series. We will demonstrate for you, walking through time from the 1950s on upwards, that every space program and all the crap that's shown to us, there's just something really drastically wrong.
And it's not just, Jason, that is such a good place to point people, because there is really no aspect of the modern space program starting, before Apollo, that we don't show does not hold water. But we pull it all the way up to the supposed pictures of Earth from space, all of which are fraudulent, all of which can be demonstrated as fraudulent. The last one, I think, if I remember correctly, was taken in 2002. It was a supposed image of Earth from space. It ended up being wallpaper for the iPhone in 2007. Talk about programming millions of minds all at once. But we know the name of the artist who created that. And there's even is attributed to him what he said about making the image, which was basically NASA handed me data and I created this image to look like I thought the Earth should look. And not only that, that 2002 fraudulent image, which is a snapshot of nothing, has been used as the foundation for endless supposed images of Earth from space since. And I'm here to tell you, you have never seen an image of anything from space ever. And I've spent a lot of time on my YouTube channel just doing basic breakdowns to show the fraud in these images.
Well, I'm with you on that, brother. And I don't know if it's just my imagination, but it seems to me that NASA have really been stepping up the fakery and the propaganda and the spin. They've been much more vocal in recent years than they were before in terms of pushing their subliminal programming out. It puts me in mind of the situation with Paul McCartney, right? The replacement of Paul McCartney, which is something that I've covered extensively on my radio shows and in my books. And again, I don't know if it's just my imagination, but ever since loads and loads of researchers have been jumping on this idea of McCartney having been replaced back in the 60s, the guy that we're told is Paul McCartney has been in the spotlight 24/7. He's doing tours, he's on chat shows, he's doing interviews. They're really ramming him down your throat as if to reinforce the idea that, no, here he is. This is Paul McCartney. These ideas that he was replaced are just ridiculous. And I'm wondering if NASA pushing all this spin and propaganda is a direct response to the number of researchers that are now questioning the official story on these things. And it's an exercise in damage limitation. And they think, my God, there's so many people that are asking these big questions now. We've got to reinforce our hype to the general public all the more.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. I mean, NASA is absolutely sweating rocket fuel right now. Jason and I did so much work for the people who followed it all the way through. I would be surprised if anyone came out the other side of all that work still buying into what NASA's pushing. But you see, it's a numbers game, isn't it? You see, when NASA does a television show like they just did with the supposed eclipse, it goes out on Nova. And in the United States, many millions, maybe even 100 million people see that explanation. Whereas us other folks who are doing the research to show that we've been lied to endlessly by these people, how many people do we reach? So I think it's a numbers game. They absolutely understand that they're in dire straits, that we've reached the digital age, that people will review what they have laid down endlessly and find all the nonsense they have put out. But there's even a bigger problem on the horizon that Jason and I outed in the course of our 6 episodes, which was basically 12 hours of podcasting. There are private corporations now in the United States, SpaceX and Virgin Galactic. You guys probably know about Virgin Galactic because Sir Richard Branson's a big part of that. But my point here is, once NASA is shuffled off the world stage and these private corporations are holding the space lie up, we will have no recourse because private citizens can't do anything to a corporation as long as they follow the rules of corporation. And that's what we see going on here. It seems like they're trying to phase NASA out as quick as they can. And we see things like the space shuttle program ending, and now we just hitch rides from Russia to the supposed fake International Space Station. We see all the kind of earmarks that show they're trying to shuffle NASA away so that these private corporations with their actors can come in and try to maintain the lie.
Okay. What do you want to say about dinosaurs? I took a quick glimpse at your YouTube channel and I saw that you have done a show recently addressing the issue of dinosaurs. I unfortunately have not had a chance to listen to that show, although I have downloaded it to listen afterwards. But what do you want to say about that whole thing?
You want to jump in on that, Jason?
Well, it's one of those things that I think all of us grew up being interested in. Most kids love the concept of dinosaurs. But the funny thing is, as soon as you start looking at any kind of actual history on dinosaurs, how they actually came about to become a staple of mainstream, you find out that it ties in with the British aristocracy as always, that you've never seen a real dinosaur skeleton. Everything is a cast of supposedly original bones, and it's just, as soon as you look at it, you find out it's all fraud. So all those wonderful bones that I saw when I took my daughter to the American Museum of History in New York a few years ago, every single one of those was not real. So that, and if you ask, they will admit it to you that, oh yeah, they're in crates put away, they're safe. A very few select groups of people are allowed to see what's supposed to be real bones. So again, this is a controlled paradigm, isn't it? That as soon as you look at how this all came about and what was originally found, you find the earmarks of fraud everywhere. They created an industry out of nothing, and I think it's just to confuse our world, and a lot of it's probably just to make money, as always.
Well, it's certainly turned into big business, but I would further point out the person who started the dinosaur nonsense was actually a knight, which means he was a servant of the royal family of Britain that knighted him, but he was also placed in the Natch as the director of the Natural History Museum. This man invented dinosaurs before a single bone, shard, tooth, anything had ever been discovered in this world. There's no portion of the timeline that anyone can take the time to look up that will hold water. And that even gets up into times where they talked about these supposed bone wars going on in the United States, where these guys are caught outright fraudulently producing things that never existed out of alligator bones and Lord knows what other bones. And, during the course of the research Jason brought to bear in our Dinosaurs Don't Exist episode, he located a place in China that is making a crapload of money, taking real bone fragments, crushing them up, and replicating fake dinosaur skeletons to be sold all over the world to museums. I mean, it goes on and on and on. The real problem here is that the average person like me, when I was a kid, I had posters of dinosaurs all over my walls. I could name them. I knew the period of time they were supposedly from. We're indoctrinated into this stuff. And even now in the United States, believe it or not, every day there's a cartoon running on children's TV called Dinosaur Train. Not dinosaur car, not dinosaur airplane, but dinosaur train, because they are training your kids to believe in nonsense. And anyone who wants to go look at the work Jason and I did, I don't understand how anyone would be able to look at the Dino Hoax episode and not come out the other side going, holy smokes, man, is it even possible that what I've just heard is correct? And I would add, anyone who goes and looks independently will find out the truth about dinosaurs.
And the same way that you used to get dinosaur toys when you were a kid, it's the same
Right.
thing as you got a globe in the classroom at school, and you'd see globes everywhere, on TV and in the toy shop and stuff like that. It's icons, it's motifs, it's getting into the subconscious of people when they're children, when their worldview is still being formed, and just kind of ramming these images home into the subliminal mind. So that for most people, that dictates what they believe about these things for the rest of their lives, unless they apply some critical thought to the situation, which sadly it would appear most people don't still.
Well, let's mention something about critical thought. The modern school system is absolutely destroying that with every effort they can, with the way they teach Common Core and all that. They're destroying anyone's capability to have critical thinking. This next generation of kids that are in school right now are in big, big trouble.
Yeah, and I would add, for the average person listening who have probably just heard quite a number of things that made their head spin, I will point this out. The most important thing in this world to the powers that be is message control. There is nothing more important than message control. Even before we ever had television or movies, or if we go back to the time when there were amphitheaters and people were in theater, the ruling class of that time knew the importance of message control. And this is a critical thing to understand, because that is what modern day media is for. That's what music is for. That's what movies are for. That is what every single program you watch on television is for. It's for programming, culturally programming the masses, and message control. And anyone who wants to test it, go out and wait for some big event like what's just happened in Houston in America, this big hurricane that went ashore. Watch the message control, watch the gas prices, watch all the things that have already been predicted that come on the tail end of an event like that. And you'll begin to understand a little bit more about what we're getting at here.
And that's probably a good point to begin to wrap up, fellas. Have you got any upcoming show series where you're going to be collaborating to talk about other subjects similar to the ones you've done so far? I mean, what's on the agenda in terms of your joint shows for the coming months?
You want to take it, Jason?
Yeah, there's a couple things I brought up to Crrow. Usually we discuss several ideas and pick which one we think is most relevant for what's going on at the moment. And up and coming, we have the science fiction programming and social engineering of our view of space. That one's pretty much ready to go. I've brought a few other things up to Crrow about the school systems and how that was taken over 100 years ago. Another big thing that's going on that a lot of people are talking about is this whole 5G network and how it might tie into AI and transhumanism. Transhumanism is a big, big thing that's going on with a lot of the elite, and you see that becoming more and more mainstream every single day. So there's a couple of topics we're definitely going to be touching on.
All right.
Yeah, I would just add, anyone who's interested in maybe challenging the worldview that they've grown up with and held on to their whole life, head over to crow777radio.com or head over to crow777 on YouTube and look at some of the work Jason and I have done. And I will add, Jason and I are not conspiracy theorists. We do not make up content. We do a week's worth of research for every show. Jason typically puts together a very thorough timeline based on publicly available information, which is generally what we use as the skeleton for any given show we do. And then we go at seeing if it holds water. And let me tell you something. The vast majority of us simply accept what the man in the white lab coat has told us. For those of us who have grown up a bit and are ready to challenge what the man in the white lab coat is telling us, there's a rude awakening on the other side. But I'm here to tell you, once you discover things like dinosaurs never existed, nuclear weapons do not exist, that the modern construct of greys and reptilians is in fact invented by people like H.G. Wells, a sci-fi writer. Once you get beyond that, you begin to see with new eyes. But anyhow, thanks so much for having me on, Mark.
No problem, man. I love your work. And just another question that occurred to me while you were speaking there. When I first got into this whole truth conspiracy game, call it what you will, alternative information, I spent a lot of time looking at the UFO agenda, aliens, extraterrestrial stuff, off-world colonies, all this kind of stuff. And I don't look at that stuff anymore because certain information that's come my way has caused me to be able to jettison all of that. because I don't believe any of it holds water, like you just said, Greys and whatever else, the UFO agenda. To me, that is distraction, and it is causing alternative researchers who could otherwise be putting their time and energy to use in much more meaningful areas to go off down all these cul-de-sacs and all these rabbit holes. It seems to me that's a whole world of stuff that you can just throw out. That's where I'm at now. You talked about growing up as a researcher,
Well, Mark,
good on you, man.
We did that one a few weeks ago. We did the social engineering programming of UFOs and aliens and reptilians and greys, and we showed where it all came from. There's no evidence for any of this stuff. I mean, I'm quite certain that UFOs get seen, and what is a UFO? An unidentified flying object.
Exactly that, yeah.
That's it. I mean, yeah, I've seen things. I don't know what they are. But as far as this insanity that people are obsessed with Pleiadians and Greys and reptilians, man, there is no evidence. That goes right hand in hand with Bigfoot. There's no evidence. It's fun. Enjoy yourself with it. But Crrow and I tore that apart a few weeks ago. You want to hear it and see where it all came from? We did that show already.
Sure.
Yeah,
okay.
And I'll give you a basis for us. I doubt if there's very many people I'll ever meet in my life who have filmed as many as what I could call UFOs as I have through telescopes. Objects that are out there that I can't identify. My YouTube channel is filled with what people would call UFOs. But Jason and I pointed out that most, besides the fact that Tavistock claimed responsibility for the modern cultural alien agenda, we showed that H.G. Wells invented Greys, that the idea of reptilians is attributed to some college professor in the United States who basically lifted it from Conan the Barbarian, so some other cartoon. And to set it all into perspective, the foundations of modern ufology basically rest on Roswell. Roswell happened on the 33rd degree parallel, and that's not far away from where the hoaxed JFK assassination happened, off the 33rd degree parallel. But anyhow, Mark, I know you were headed in a direction, man. Go ahead.
I was just going to point out that you've got a whole industry built around the whole UFO alien agenda. You've got conferences where hundreds of people get together in hotels and, conference centers or whatever, and they come from all around the world and they spend a whole weekend looking at supposed information to support the idea of aliens and UFOs and off-world entities and all this kind of thing. And you don't get that with other areas of the sort of truth conspiracy research field. So you don't get social engineering and culture creation conferences where 400 people get together and talk about how culture creation gets done through Tavistock and things like that. You don't get conferences about transhumanism and 5G technology and where all that's headed. But you do get people getting very obsessive about all this alien and UFO stuff. So it's quite unique within this area of research, I would say, those kind of subjects in terms of the number of people that seem to get turned on by it.
Well, truly, belief is the enemy of knowing. I think what's reflected in what you just said is people want to believe in these things. Because if they didn't want to believe in these things, they would look at things like Roswell and understand, if you want to accept anything happened at Roswell, at the very foundational basis of the Roswell idea, you have to accept that people in the military couldn't tell the difference between a crashed flying saucer and a weather balloon. So that's what you're being asked to accept at the very foundations. And this is the real crux of what Jason and I do over on our podcast. We point out show after show that belief is in fact the enemy of knowing. Either you want to believe in things in this world or you want to know about things in this world. And I think aliens is a prime example of people really, really want to believe that there's other beings out there. And they want to believe it so much that they just fail to examine anything along the way.
Absolutely. Awesome conversation. So it's Crrow777 on YouTube for anyone that wants to recap on the shows you've done. Jason, Secrets of Saturn continues, right? The podcast series?
I haven't been doing it as much as I had been, but I still keep up. I have a couple Facebook pages that I allow people to post to, and I'm going to keep that going. It's just doing the show every week with Crrow takes up most of my time, and what we're doing there is so good that I'm happy with the work that we put out every week.
All right, then. Well, thanks for coming on today. Great conversation, guys, and much respect for the work you do. Love it.
This is just for fun.
I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations. I'm picking up vibrations.